Hi everyone, good morning. Right, it looks like everybody that's going to join us joined now, so we'll get underway. Very good morning to you all, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. And welcome to the K3 Hub. My name is Marie Wadeson, and I'm a managing director at the K3 Capital Group, and I also lead the K3 Hub. There's a little bit about the K3 Hub on the screen now, I hope. We're here for a review of the spring statement, where yesterday Rachel Reeves delivered an update on her plans for the UK economy. She outlined update growth forecasts from the OBR, confirmed that she is forecast to meet her borrowing targets towards the end of the decade, with over 23 billion to spare, and told us that the 2% inflation target would be met, which means that we'll be better off, but unemployment is predicted to rise. So I'm not going to pretend to be Jeremy, our speaker today. He's going to fill us in on all of the highs and the lows. So I'll just move on to some quick housekeeping for you. We are recording today's session. You've probably seen that as you've joined the webinar. The webinar will be posted on the K3 Hub website next week. Normally, we do share slides in the chat, but on this occasion, we're not going to. You can, however, as I just said, you can look back on the recording at your convenience next week. Q&A function is open. I'm chairing today, so if you could put all of your questions into the Q&A rather than the chat, so I've got everything in one place, that would be marvellous. We think we've got quite a few questions. We have already got quite a few questions that have come in. We're anticipating we'll get quite a few more. If we don't manage to get through all of them, please accept my apologies in advance. I'll put them to our speaker after the session and he'll come back to you. We are going to run a few short polls today, so please feel free to participate. Your responses are anonymous and it is just for fun. Right, so on to today's webinar then. So very pleased to welcome back Jeremy Mindell. Jeremy, we've worked with for over 10 years now. Jeremy runs several webinars and in-person events for us and his tax sessions are particularly popular. Jeremy has been lecturing in taxation for over 20 years. He also covers issues related to pensions, share schemes, and remuneration, and is one of the very few individuals in the country who is both a qualified chartered tax advisor and also holds a certificate from the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development. Jeremy, thank you for joining us again, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Marie. So good morning, everybody. Yes, we're talking about the Spring Statement 2026. A few years ago, this would have been the main budget, and I'll explain what the Spring Statement is about shortly. But as Marie said, it gives the chance, the opportunity, the requirement indeed, to update on her forecasts that she made for the economy last November, along with the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility. And of course, given the fact that it was a late budget, right at the end of November, 26th of November, and it's an early spring statement, not a lot of time has elapsed between them, effectively only the 4 months of December, January, and February. But of course, quite a lot has happened, particularly in the last week, with war breaking out again in the Middle East, which I think may have somewhat overshadowed what she said, but will have an important effect, I think, on the economy. The issue is do you think that we are in a position of steady as she goes, or do you think the economy is being driven off a cliff, or do you think it is in slow and potentially managed decline? So there are a number of points that could give you either reasons for confidence or reasons for pessimism, or maybe something in between. I think that the other alternative scenarios look at things like, for example, you're going to look at the possibility that we're in the frog boiling position, that actually we're in a situation where things are getting gradually deteriorating in a number of different areas, but actually not enough that people is causing acute pain, except in certain sectors. And that's another scenario that you could look at, maybe one that you wouldn't look at if you're in the hospitality sector, which has certainly seen a real problem. And the other element is what I call the lemon squeezer. In other words, taxes have gone up. How much are they squeezing the economy? Or to put another analogy, at what point do the tires get bald from the additional taxes, and we end up with real potential damage. And this is, of course, a matter of some contention between different commentators from the left and the right, who will give you different interpretations of the effects of taxes. But let's go back to why a spring statement. Well, it's there to update, as I said, the economic forecast in the autumn budget, although it's only 3 months ago. Published the OBR forecast. So the OBR makes forecasts and those updated forecasts, the idea is that you have the budget at the beginning of October, and you have nearly 6 months between the elements. But this was not the budget. And in one thing, undoubtedly, Rachel Reeves succeeded. She did not announce new tax measures or spending measures. This was very much steady as it goes. And she was looking, if you like, to downgrade the importance of this. She wanted to keep it low key without any fireworks. And at one point, there was talk of a junior official in the Treasury actually delivering the spring statement. Now, she didn't go that far. And indeed, obviously, the spring statement very much overshadowed by international events this week. But in that respect, she did succeed in making sure that it didn't create the sort of waves that have been created before and after the 2025 budget, which I talked about last year, and particularly the pre-budget speculation and indeed the pressures on spending were not replicated in the spring statement. Why a spring statement? Well, the autumn budget combines tax and expenditure. It also means under the timetable that the finance bill is passed before the start of the new tax year, so it's not retrospective. And having one budget does undoubtedly give you more stability rather than, changes twice or more a year. So it does have significant advantages to this system. And I think combining tax and spending is a sensible idea as long as you keep your projections in a realistic format. The disadvantages are, what if the forecasts go awry, as they can do, although we'll talk about the changes of the forecasts. Spring statements and the autumn budget are often a focus for more spending, more pressures on spending, and particularly short-term fixes. And the third point is uncertainty grows if the government makes U-turns. And given that we've had about 14 of them in the past 18 months and counting, that's an area where the spring statement at least did not create or increase uncertainty in the short term. But it's difficult not to think about a potential darkening mood in certain areas. Unemployment at a 5-year high, 5.2%, and due to go up, according to the OBR. The economy is somewhat stagnant. It is growing, but at a really quite slow rate. Confidence is generally low and growth downgraded again in 2026. And although I was told it was upgraded in 2027, that was only after a downgrade that had happened before. So, and you've got issues in certain areas. So it's quite interesting. We talk of construction, where the government has set a target of 1.5 million extra homes, but confidence in the building sector has reduced. And indeed, there are now skill shortages again, as something that is partly to do with net migration figures, something I'll come on to a bit later. So why don't we get the first poll up? So on the first poll, with 1 being the least good performance, 10 being the best, how do you rate Rachel Reeves' performance on a scale of 1 to 10 on that basis, with 1 being the worst and 10 being the best? Hey, shall we look at some answers if we've got some votes in? Remember, they are anonymous. Oh, so it's fair to say that nobody's above seven, and there are very few above five, and the vast majority sit in the one to four category there. So fairly low performance figures that are given on that basis. Um, let's move on. One of the areas that was talked about, so I heard Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, just before on the Today programme, trumpeting the fact that borrowing was reducing. And what we can see is that the ABR forecast is that borrowing will reduce over a period of time. We had the big budget surplus, and you can see the borrowing has, this is cumulative borrowing over the year, and it's still, when you consider that we're not in a crisis position, nobody's saying that we are, that's a very steep amount of borrowing. Of course, what we did get was the surplus for January, which is when self-assessment tax receipts come in and people make their first payments on account for 25-26. So that's the 24-25 tax outcome. And the payments on account for 25-26, you'll see that the surplus is very high indeed. And that is a good in one respect because it helps with public finances. But you may well ask, are those higher taxes squeezing the economy? Two sides of the equation. It also shows that for all the criticism of HMRC, they are pretty good at bringing in money. In terms of the tax and national insurance rises that have been the most difficult, I think that you're talking about the national insurance, but also the rise in the national minimum wage. So since it's been increasing, you'll notice that at the right hand of the chart, it's definitely picked up the pace of increase. And we'll talk about that further. But if you look at a figure of what we're looking at, £12.71, a lot of employers are saying that this is frankly unaffordable. Now, the reasons for national living wage increases, at least at the start, and national minimum wage, was that the government felt otherwise it was subsidizing low wages through tax credits and universal credit. So the idea was you give people wage rises at the lower end. Not only do you give them a fair day's wage for a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, but you actually reduce the burden on the government. And that was certainly what the coalition government was looking at when they increased the national living wage. It has gone up. And that is there is a point at which some people think you need to take the pedal off the accelerator. And it'll be interesting to see. There are rumours of a U-turn on that as well. If you look at the Class 1 employer national insurance receipts, which is part of the reason for increased tax receipts, you'll see that there is quite a squeeze on employers in terms of employment costs, particularly due to the fact not just the increase of 1.5% to 15% national insurance contributions for employers, but also the drop, 1.2%, but the drop in the threshold at which employers' NIC is paid from £9,100 to £5,000, and that threshold remaining the same until 2030-31 at the least. And the interesting element there is that squeeze is particularly proportionately on lower paid workers. In terms of employing lower paid workers, you've seen a £615 increase in your bills just because the threshold has gone down. That's not so important for your high-flying lawyer, but it is important in the hospitality sector. You're also seeing taxes going up. So the March forecast shows that taxes as a percentage of GDP sailing well beyond 38% of GDP. Now, given the fact it was below 35% of GDP as recently as 2024, indeed early into 25, that's a stonking increase in taxes, which of course will have an effect on the economy. And as I said, in terms of the increase in costs, so employers have been hit with employer national insurance increases. They've also been hit with the national living wage, and they're going to be hit with the Employment Rights Bill, which gives rights against unfair dismissal after 6 months and other rights. It is perhaps not surprising that actually this has hit unemployment amongst the 16 to 24-year-olds, which is now at a level briefly seen during the COVID period, but otherwise not seen for now about a dozen years. And the government's starting to think about that. And one of the measures it's thinking about, it was looking to equalize the national living wage across ranges. It's now decided, well, there's no point increasing the national living wage for younger people too much, because there's no point having a national living wage that it prices young people without experience out of work. Would you rather take a highly paid, inexperienced person, or relatively highly paid, or would you want to pay them a little bit more for an experienced person? So younger people have undoubtedly been squeezed out of the market. And to its credit, the government's looking at potentially another U-turn, going slow on the age equalisation. Other elements are the OBR said that welfare will rise from 314 billion at the beginning of this parliament to 406 billion by the end of the parliament, which is a very, very substantial rise. That's higher than the whole defence budget sits at the moment. Unemployment stabilising at 5.33%, so still going up, and then potentially gradually falling towards the end of 2026. And the other element is net migration falling. And that may also have an effect in terms of other areas like construction, which is heavily dependent on imported skills. If your plumbers go back to Poland and Romania because their economies are growing faster than ours, that may create shortages and dent the ambitions to build us back to prosperity. This is what the Tony Blair Institute said in its most damning intervention there. The former Prime Minister's think tank took aim at a raft of Labour's flagship policies, criticising decisions to ramp up the minimum wage, national insurance contributions, and add more workers' rights red tape. This is not a right-wing body. This is the Tony Blair Institute, sort of centre-left. The think tank he runs said Labour should reverse course on a raft of its flagship labour market policies as the economy struggles and unemployment surges. At this point, let's take the second poll that I had. So how do you rate the prospects for the British economy on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being pessimistic and 10 being optimistic? Oh my goodness. So here what we've got is most people are in the not absolutely depressed out of all recognition. So fewer in the 1 and 2s. Again, nobody in the 8, 9s and 10s. Only a couple of people at 7. So the vast majority of people are pessimistic, but not completely down in the dumps. And I would say that that's a fairly accurate, certainly view that I would have, that it's not great, but it's not absolutely, Gotterdammerung isn't round the corner. Um, if we look at the issue of unemployment, obviously, the Conservatives are very keen on pointing out that every time Labour has left office, they've left with unemployment higher than before. This is a famous poster from the 1979 general election. And I think that there's going to be more focus about job creation. For the last 15 years, even with austerity in the coalition period and so on, the UK was a pretty good generator of jobs. Now, for whatever reason, you could argue it was government policy. You could argue it was AI, for example. You could argue all sorts of different reasons. But what the British economy is not doing is creating a lot of jobs. And that is going to be a problem, particularly for younger, inexperienced people, but could be seen further up the chain. There are areas that they may wish to review, particularly with the Strait of Hormuz being potentially blockaded. We're not quite sure about that. But if you look at oil gas output, and this is a long-term element that you've seen a reduction in oil gas output, but recent policies have not helped in terms of that. And whether the government's going to rethink energy security is certainly something that might be on their agenda. Our energy imports are at an all-time high, which may not be a particularly comfortable position to be in at the moment. And it will be interesting to see whether the renewable energy boom that we've been promised will actually save us from even higher energy costs, because undoubtedly that is an element that manufacturers are citing in terms of deterring them from investing further in the UK. And of course, this has had an effect, particularly in oil and gas revenues, where you can see that oil and gas revenues are reducing every year. And somehow the government needs to fill its fiscal hole on that basis. Just to show you that the effect on jobs has been extremely uneven, what you can see is that actually the big effect has been on the 16 to 24-year-olds, followed by the 35 to 49-year-olds. And the very experienced people have been seen less of an issue. And interesting enough, those who have some experience but maybe, are still considered as young and eager, have seen the least issues apart from the actually over the normal state retirement age. So a real focus on the fact that the 16 to 24-year-olds, the needs, the not in employment, education or training, those numbers of people have gone up. And the government has brought in a former minister in order to look at that and see whether there need to be changes on that basis. Unemployment, as I said, due to go up to 5.33% before falling. And that is the sort of the Bank of England and also the OBR forecast. Clearly, if the job market gets looser, you would expect wage growth to slow. The government talked, and Darren Jones mentioned it again, that he thought that people would have £1,000 more in their pockets at the end of the Parliament, but that very much depends on the situation, because greater unemployment will have an effect on spending power and also the ability for workers to secure higher wages. The one bit of undoubtedly good news, although again could be affected by points in the Middle East, is the Bank of England base rate, which has had a number of cuts since the general election. And the expectation is that there'll be some more cuts in the interest rate. But as I said, as I've said on previous occasions, I can't see it going below 3%. So extra stimulus from this area is likely to be limited. Something I left you with last time, and this is a graph from the Spectator, but also they've sourced it from the Office for Budget Responsibility, is, and it was highlighted yesterday by commentators, but not mentioned much, is that over the next couple of years, spending space to grow so sharply, and then it's supposed to come down. Taxation, in order to meet the government's fiscal headroom, and indeed Rachel Reeves said that she had 23 billion extra of that, taxation is going up, and sharply, in the years leading up to the general election. Now, whether this is credible is another matter. I don't know of many governments that have raised taxes as sharply as this one is planning to before a general election. And this is where the bond market may notice something that you might want to think about. As I said, although this was from November 25, from the budget, actually the spring statement did very little. It did, which I think was a success. You didn't want to see a big fiscal event, and Rachel Reeves managed to ensure that this was not a big fiscal event, which I suppose contributed to an aura of stability rather than anything worse than that. Talking about borrowing being lower, which obviously is a good thing from the government's point of view, but still what we're looking at is something that is cumulatively quite a burden on future generations. And as I say, one of the elements that I think the government trumpeted was that living standards will be going up, and there was an upgrade to that. But again, when you take into account the issues with the pandemic, living standards at the time of the general election are forecast to be just 1.2% higher than before the pandemic. So, if the economy is not growing very substantially, we can't really justify paying ourselves a lot more on that basis. One of the issues that has come up in terms of this is quarterly GDP, where we've really seen, with the exception of Q1 2025, since the general election, we've seen really very modest growth. Now, we've not seen recession, which is good. We've not seen a depression, which is even better. But what we've seen is that growth is rarely getting out of first gear. And one can ask questions about why that would be the case. And inflation, as you can see here, having gone fairly high, particularly on CPI, which excludes housing costs, is supposed to abate a bit down towards the target of 3%. However, and maybe down to 2%, the issue that you're going to have there is you don't know what effect the war will have. Can we bring up the next poll, please? So looking at, if you were the Chancellor, what would you do? Cut taxes and cut spending, raise taxes and raise spending, make no significant changes. I've not given you the option of increasing borrowing further because I think maybe I should have done. There might be some people who just say, oh no, just borrow more, or make no significant changes. So please vote on those. Okay, what's the result? The vast majority would cut taxes and cut spending. That's the most decisive element that we've had, with a very small number saying raise taxes and spending, and a few more saying make no significant changes. And I think that that's interesting because we're getting a situation close to what we've had in 2010 and 1979, where there's a sort of emerging consensus that we're going to need some radical changes potentially, either delivered by this government or by the next government, whoever it might be. And there is a sort of learning curve that the government recognizes that I think that at least it cannot add more to the tax burden than it's already announced. The question is going to be is whether they're going to be forced into radical changes, because if the economy downgrades, is there anywhere else for them to go? Let's have a look at one of those potential black swan events. Before we decided not to help the Americans, we might have looked at where our top exports go, and they go a lot to the United States. We are very dependent on our trade with the United States. We run a surplus. And one of the sort of black swan events could happen is what happens if the American market goes sour on us, because we seem to have lost our special relationship. And that could be particularly disastrous in a number of areas. Of course, that might not happen, but just to point out, we are very dependent on the American market. If you look at our total trade, what you notice there is it's above 300 billion. And also that we run, when you take into account services, a very healthy surplus with the United States. Now, until recently, in terms of relative position, they have given the UK some preferential treatment. I think that the King's visit to the United States is going to become even more important in patching up relations, because we can't afford to lose that export market. The good news is that inflation is finally coming down after some measures which I think boosted it. But of course, that is before any effect from the war in the Middle East, and low interest rates eventually. Again, we don't know whether the war in the Middle East is going to mean that actually there might be a pause in interest rates cuts. There are, of course, other ideas. So those few individuals who said we ought to raise taxes and raise spending might be interested in wealth taxes. And certainly what we've seen with the rise of the Greens, the rise of people like Mandami, the mayor of New York, the government in Spain, is a real diverging between the left and the right in politics worldwide. And that's why wealth taxes have become more of a topic of conversation than they've been before. There are only three countries which do a full wealth tax, which is Norway, Switzerland, and Spain. The Netherlands was looking at effectively a wealth tax, a capital gains tax on unrealized assets. So just because your assets grow in value, you don't have to sell them and they'll tax them. But it is interesting that it is still only three countries in Europe that have done this, and a number of states, California, New York, are potentially looking at wealth taxes. It is something on the agenda, but I don't think it's likely unless you get a real significant change in administration. The government has set its face against it. And despite the fact that there's been a lot of uncertainty about government policies, at least 14 U-turns, this would be one that I think might be one a step too far in terms of business confidence. Can we bring on the next poll, please? If you had to cut spending, and the 4/5 of you, over 80%, said you would, what would you what would you target? Select all that apply. Okay, let's see what people said. Ooh, size of the civil service. I can understand that. Out of work benefits, triple lock pensions. Last time, triple lock pensions won on it. And two people think we should actually do defense. That's interesting. Public investment. Maybe they think, too many HS2s. But yeah, size of the civil service, which has grown since in the last 10 years, out of work benefits, and a considerable number for triple lock pensions. Thank you very much. Um, so I'm just going to make a few comments. So there I was trawling the press that I would think would be slightly more. I mean, the government's undoubtedly had some issues, lots of rumblings about the leadership. And I'm sort of trawling the press that is more considered more sympathetic to the government, at least from where it sits on the political spectrum. And then I come across their senior editor at large who says something about somebody you might guess who might be peevish, thin skinned, rude, and self righteous. Oh dear. That didn't fill me with a great deal of joy. Then I went to The Economist, which, of course, at the last general election actually backed Palmer and Labour, and it said, and this was after 2 weeks ago's events, a prime minister who clings on to power by handing out treats is not running a government, but an ice cream van. And it pointed out that bond investors might lose patience if they think that they have no serious plan to keep public finances under control. I think that the spring statement, with its cut in borrowing, certainly helped allay some of the fears. But in an interesting element from the wall is that bond yields have gone up again, and therefore the UK cost of borrowing has gone up again, which may, of course, wipe out some of her fiscal headroom. If I look at the effects of the new war in the Middle East, obviously it has the effect on energy. So somebody before the session was saying she was dreading filling up her car with petrol the next time she went to the petrol station. The alternative argument is, of course, that we become an island of stability. You may hear less about people saying, I'm off to Dubai because the taxes and the position is much better. So remember, relatively, there's no cloud without some form of silver lining, and you could end up with a position whereby actually is an island of stability that the people look again at the UK. The government still has a healthy majority in the House of Commons. It still should last until 2029. The question is what actual measures it can now get through. Can we have the next poll, please? Okay, well, the answers on that. Oh, no, I take a more optimistic view about the safe haven. Um, but the majority of you have said they'll depress the economy. I think in the medium term, it may help in terms of promoting something the government has tried to do is promote us as a haven of stability on that basis. And if the government seizes that opportunity, in not just in terms of uh, that we're not being shot at, but also in terms of AI, a stable framework for that, life sciences and so on. There are some opportunities, but most of you are taking a less optimistic point of view. I'll take the second last poll, if I may, as well. I think poll 6. So if you wanted to leave the UK, where should you go, given the fact you're saying that the economy will be depressed? Okay, Australia. Oh, right. Australia wins. And then comes New Zealand, which is quite interesting because, oh, and Canada, so English speaking countries for obvious reasons. Dubai has fallen down the listing. I think at the budget, Dubai was quite a lot higher on that basis. And interesting, New Zealand is suffering an emigration crisis at the moment as more people move, including Jacinda Ardern, from New Zealand to Australia. So there are vacancies to go there. But interesting, a real spread of places, with the sort of the Commonwealth countries being the most popular. Thank you. Um, in terms of the war, I sort of was thinking about it this morning that it's a bit like if you've ever seen the film Casablanca, which is an allegory, interestingly enough, on an opposite situation where the UK was accusing America of sitting on the sidelines. And if you know the story, there is Rick, a bartender in Casablanca, who plays the rather disillusioned American who's got involved in a war before, in his case, the Spanish Civil War, and doesn't want to get involved again. And events eventually force Rick to get involved in the war. And as he said, things may not go well, but I need to get involved. And it's quite an interesting analogy because at the moment, the UK, mindful of its experience in Iraq in 2003, wanted to stay on the sidelines, but for how long it can stay on the sidelines is open to some doubt, and that obviously will have a major effect on government policy, whether they like it or not. They will need to do actions that they will feel uncomfortable with the longer this war goes on, and the more British interests, British territories, and British people are affected. There are obviously opportunities, defence-led manufacturing renaissance. So a lot of talk about manufacturing jobs disappearing, but also potentially manufacturing jobs coming back, as we will want security of supply on defence elements. So, you look at defence companies, you look at the companies supplying key elements to defence, either in terms of software or hardware or components. Those are likely to do well. The UK is a haven in troubled times. I wouldn't overlook that. The freedom from EU rules. What was quite interesting in Financial Times, which is certainly not a pro-Brexit paper, reported that when the government talked about a reset of relations with the EU, the CC said, we don't really want this. We're quite happy with how things are going outside the EU without the EU regulations. And the other element is there are signs in elements as their revised attitude to youth, minimum wage and so on, is government learning on the job, trying to make sure after the problems with the pre-budget period and all the leaks and different elements last time, that the spring statement was downplayed. And indeed, I think that they succeeded in making sure that there was stability rather than uncertainty were the main headlines. Whether that's enough, given our deep-seated problems, I think I would go back and say our problems go back over many governments, basically since the beginning of the financial crisis, which made a big dent in UK GDP in 2007-8. We've never been back on a really buoyant growth path. To give it some perspective, at the beginning of 2000, economists were thinking that we were going to catch up with the US economy by about 2030. Now we're in a position that our GDP per person is about 2/3 of the US, and we're falling further behind. So there are some long-term problems, and stability may not be enough to deal with them. But I think it's certainly better than the sort of levels of uncertainty created before the last budget. At that point, let's have the final poll, and then over to Marie for questions. So as a percentage of GDP, should defence spending be 1%, 2%, 3% is the government's target, 4, 5, 6%, or another figure? Okay, let's see what the results are there. Ooh, quite high, between 3 and 5%, with some outliers, some people going for 6%, and a few people, one person going for 1%. Okay, so a general consensus on higher defence spending. Okay, thank you very much. At that point, I'll hand back to Marie.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. There's a lot to get our teeth into there, I think. Just before I dive into the questions, I just wanted to give a quick plug to a few of our forthcoming CPD events, if everybody will forgive me for doing so. 20th of March, we've got employment and payroll taxes. 27th of March, tax issues associated with business structures. And I know that is super, super popular right now. And 17th of March, we've got a VAT update, which is always very popular. Right, so into the questions then, Jeremy. So just to get us going, what do you think the government got right yesterday?
I think it got right the fact that it was keeping it very stable, very low key. I don't think we needed any more fireworks or any radical elements for yesterday. And those people who are complaining, look, it's not dealing with the long term problems, I think are missing the point. We've had too much chop and change recently. And I think the government got it right to say sort of steady as she goes, especially with the war thing. I mean, the only thing I would have potentially wanted was I would have thought there should have been some more about defence, and actually we need to probably increase it, as the vast majority of participants have said, and probably increase it quicker, given the fact that we've got British territories under attack and British citizens in danger. But I think that generally the tone was about right. And I think that if we'd had lots of major changes, I think, oh my goodness, everyone would have sort of thrown their teacups, they've thrown their teacups away on that basis.
Thank you. So one of the questions that's come in, I'm just going to read it as it's come in. So there is a general consensus amongst economists even that we need to invest more, brackets public and private, to increase productivity and drive an increase in living standards. Given this fact, why isn't the government ruthlessly pursuing an investment strategy?
It's a good question. I mean, one of my thoughts was that if I was Rachel Reeves and I thought, maybe my time in office is limited, what could I do which would have a lasting effect? And then, at least in retrospect, people say I did a really good job. And that would be to boost public investment. I think it's more, HS2 has shown it can be quite difficult. You can get good and bad things and you can get real problems. There's also a problem with skills shortages. But I think it's a question of the money. I think realistically, it's difficult to see how the government can really borrow much more. And particularly if interest rates start going back up again, or the bond market loses patience. So in order to invest more, you probably need to cut current spending. And I see that as being really politically difficult when Rachel Reeves looks at the tone and attitude of her backbenchers. So yes, I mean, in an ideal world, given the issues that the UK has, public infrastructure is normally a very good way of spending money. As long as you get the planning right. Most public spending projects, particularly in a crowded island like our own, are probably very good. I mean, you think of the Elizabeth line, you think of HS1, the Channel Tunnel rail loop, or some of the big road projects. They generally do bring economic growth, but it's a question of where you get the money from to do that.
Thank you. Right, a couple more questions before we conclude then in that case. So, and you touched on this already. So over the weekend we saw the onset of the Iran war. What kind of impact do you think this might have on the economy?
Well, short term, it's undoubtedly going to give problems because energy prices will rise. And when energy prices rise, that sucks demand out of the economy. We're spending more money on oil, we're going to spend money less on other elements, and also has an effect on confidence. It might lead to reorientation of policy in terms of energy security. The dash for net zero needs to either be reframed in the terms of energy security, or they're going to have to change the mix of energy policy to ensure that the lights stay on. because we can't necessarily guarantee. I mean, we've seen with the Ukraine war, we've seen now with the Middle East, you've got both of them together. Energy security, I think, has gone up the food chain in terms of priority. In terms of the UK, if I was trying to sell the UK, I would be pushing the island of stability, the haven of stability, and I think that is something where the UK over its many hundreds of years of relative stability can really cash in.
Very good. Any views on how long the situation in the Middle East might last? I was chatting to some friends in the Middle East over the weekend. Most of them were of the view that it would blow over quickly.
Ah, I'll be honest, I have no idea. The only thing I can say as an aphorism is that it's relatively easy to start a war. It's not so easy to end it.
Yeah,
And the issue you have is that regime change from the air has only, to my view, happened once or twice. I think when the Serbian regime under Slobodan Milosevic was replaced at the end of the in the 1990s. So it's difficult to know what the end game would be, and my thought would be is that it should only be a few weeks, but you don't know. It is unbelievably unpredictable because you've got both sides are not particularly predictable in what they do.
indeed, indeed. Right, moving on from that then. So another question that's come in: what would you do to increase job opportunities for graduates with traditional academic degrees?
Um, Number one, I would look at differential national insurance rates for ages, um, because obviously they're normally above the national minimum wage. But I would look at whether I could um, encourage employers to take on inexperienced people uh, using the national insurance system by giving them a reduced rate, like you do for veterans, apprentices, and so on. I would also potentially be looking at a training program in terms of absolute job related skills so that people are equipped better for the world of work. Let's say you studied history or Latin or whatever. It's very good at developing the mind. How are you going to use that in the world of work? And I'd be looking at trying to get universities to better create programs to help people find work in that basis.
I think some good thoughts there, good thoughts. Right, I'm going to come on to my last question, and this is actually from me. So, today's audience primarily consists of professional advisors and those in the sort of the financial advisory communities. Any thoughts for them in terms of next steps with their clients following yesterday's spring statement?
I think that the most important thing is not to overreact. We've seen lots of people overreact. So, people selling businesses because they're worried about capital gains tax, and then finding that actually, because they're in the rush of people selling, they achieve less money than they would have done if they'd held on. People giving away assets because of IHT and then not having enough to live on or comfortably live on for the rest of their lives. People deciding to leave the country and then deciding, no, I don't think I can really do that for all sorts of other reasons, and spending a lot of money making plans that don't come to fruition. I think the most important thing in a period of uncertainty, and we're certainly in that, is for people to really get a grip on what they're doing. If they run an owner managed business, what are their profits levels for this year, not last year, but this year? What are their projections? So what can they pay in dividends? What can they draw in salary and so on? If they're talking about their business, what is their projection for the next 5 years on their business on the pessimistic, optimistic, and realistic viewpoint? How much wealth have they got? Are they generating wealth, or are they actually net spenders? And having that information at their fingertips is going to make it easier to make informed, rational decisions when it becomes appropriate, rather than I must do something, set up a trust, go abroad, sell my business, whatever, give money away. And people are doing that without the information and knowledge actually to make an informed decision. So it's about knowing what your position is, what your goals are, what your resources are, and what your commitments are before you start making any rash decisions.
Steady as she goes then. Very good. Right. Well, thank you very much in that case, Jeremy. I've run out of all of my questions. So all that's left to say is thank you to you, Jeremy, for coming on as usual. Thank you to all of our delegates for joining us today, and hope to see you back on the K3 Hub soon. Have a great rest of the week.